At first, it looked like routine monitoring footage from the Florida Everglades. Nothing unusual, nothing worth a second glance. But when researchers pressed play, the room went silent. Water moved without wind. Vegetation bent in perfect rhythm. Entire stretches of marsh seemed to rise and fall as if something beneath the ground was breathing. Officials ordered the footage withheld almost immediately. The footage they refused to explain. The investigation began in the most ordinary way imaginable. A small survey team returned to an Everglades monitoring station to collect routine environmental data. The moment they reviewed the first file, the atmosphere in the research room changed. Something in the footage carried a weight that felt wrong even before anyone could define it. Automatic monitoring stations had captured 3 separate nighttime clips showing shallow water rippling in synchronized pulses, and each pulse rose upward with a precision that resembled deliberate movement. There was no wind, and no passing wildlife, and no surface disturbance of any kind. When hydrologists examined the timestamps, the sense of unease deepened. The logs confirmed there had been no rain anywhere in the region. Flow control gates were sealed at every structure, and the tide remained completely flat. Seismic sensors reported no tremors or underground jolts. Every measurable force that could create synchronized water movement was silent. The team reviewed the clip again and noticed something even more disturbing. Nearby, sawgrass bent in perfect rhythmic intervals as if responding to the pulse. The timing was so precise that one analyst whispered that the ground itself seemed to be breathing. The most unsettling footage came from the third clip. The camera showed a wide stretch of open water becoming completely still, so still it looked frozen in place. Then the entire surface suddenly dropped several centimeters as if the bottom had been pulled downward. Fish were left exposed on wet mud under the moonlight, lying motionless because the water had vanished beneath them in a single instant. Seconds later, the water rose again and covered them. Nothing in nature behaves like this. It was not a wave, and it was not draining through the soil. The movement looked like a single powerful breath being pushed out from something hidden deep under the marsh. Internal emails leaked days later revealed the terror that spread among Everglades staff. Researchers who normally wrote in calm scientific language sounded shaken. One reported that pressure changes were appearing without a detectable source. Another message issued a direct order that the footage must not be released to the public until the origin of the phenomenon could be identified. These first reports from field teams did not seem alarming on their own. None of them realized at the time that they were documenting the early stages of something that violated every known rule of hydrology. The disturbing turn. The truth came into focus only when team members' isolated notes were brought together. Once the data was viewed as a single picture, it became clear that the Everglades water system had begun acting with a disturbing independence that no one could explain. Survey teams working the night shift were the first to witness the change. They saw water levels rise in complete silence during hours when the ecosystem is normally still. These rises reversed by morning as if the entire marsh had breathed in darkness and released its breath before sunrise. No natural mechanism supports this behavior. Water does not lift itself and settle again without an external force. The reports grew stranger as the survey routes expanded. Entire ponds that should have remained stable drained overnight. The water did not sink slowly into the soil. It vanished as if pulled into a new pathway hidden beneath the ground. Florida limestone normally absorbs water at a predictable rate. This drainage was far faster than anything recorded in the region. It suggested that new cavities or channels had opened somewhere deep under the marsh. The possibility that the ground beneath the Everglades was changing shape created a deep unease among hydrologists who understood what such a shift could mean. Dry season zones stayed flooded for weeks beyond their normal limits. Meanwhile, areas that have been wet for generations began drying in strange ways. The soil did not recede irregularly but formed sharp geometric patterns that looked impossibly precise. These shapes spread across the landscape like marks left by a buried structure shifting beneath the surface. Satellite imagery revealed faint depressions and shallow warping of the land. These distortions did not match any known surface process. They were too large, too aligned, and too consistent to be random. Pressure records were reviewed next. The data showed faint, repeating pulses that did not line up with rainfall cycles, tidal behavior, or controlled water releases. The numbers revealed a steady rhythmic force rising from below with no visible source. A tense multi-agency meeting followed. Maps, pressure readings, satellite images, and field notes covered the tables. After hours of grim discussion, one engineer finally spoke the words everyone had been avoiding. Something underneath the Everglades had started to move. The surface anomalies were only symptoms of a much deeper change that no one fully understood. As hydrologists traced the origin points of these disturbances, wildlife biologists began noticing something just as disturbing. Animals were shifting their movements in ways that suggested they sensed the hidden force long before humans did. When nature breaks formation, wildlife biologists noticed changes long before they understood what those changes meant. Birds began abandoning nesting grounds that had remained stable for generations. Mammals moved in erratic patterns that did not match food availability, predator pressure, or seasonal behavior. Even the predators themselves seemed unsettled. At first, these signs appeared isolated. Only later did scientists realize they were witnessing the biological response to the underground disturbances growing beneath the Everglades. The earliest shift was seen in the wading birds. Colonies that had remained fixed for decades suddenly emptied out. The birds did not scatter randomly. They moved in sweeping, organized pathways toward regions the researchers had not predicted. The distances were too great, and the timing too coordinated to be instinctive randomness. When the team overlaid their movement routes onto the hydrological maps, the connection became unmistakable. The birds were relocating along the same corridors where the strange water movements had been documented. They were following invisible boundaries that the human eye could not detect, but their bodies seemed to register with absolute clarity. Rodent populations provided the next alarm. Field surveys showed a strange pattern. Populations in some areas surged with explosive speed. In other areas only a few miles away, the numbers collapsed with no sign of disease or predation. These population swings were not random fluctuations. Each rise and fall traced the edges of the same disturbance zones that hydrologists had marked. It was as if the rodents were clustering in pockets that felt stable and abandoning pockets that no longer obeyed the familiar cues of soil moisture and food distribution. The ground beneath them had changed, and their instincts responded even when the changes remained invisible. Large predators began to behave strangely as well. Alligators appeared in places where they had never taken territory. They moved in loose clusters and snapped their heads repeatedly against the water, a known signal of agitation and territorial breakdown. Rangers who had monitored these animals for years understood the seriousness of this change. Alligators do not alter territory lightly. Their sudden displacement meant that deep environmental cues had shifted. Native snakes offered another disturbing clue. Their numbers should have increased as python control efforts succeeded. Instead, population surveys showed no rebound. Tissue samples from captured individuals revealed elevated stress hormones and disrupted neurological markers. Scientists concluded that the snakes were losing their environmental anchors. The cues that guided hunting, mating, and sheltering were no longer consistent. Something had destabilized the very signals that these animals relied on to survive. One morning, a ranger radioed in a sighting that became a turning point for the entire research team. He had watched a long stretch of wetlands as the sun rose. In a single moment, every bird in the area lifted off at exactly the same time. They moved in one immense wave and headed in the same direction without hesitation. The ranger later said that it looked as if the birds had felt a warning pass through the ground. When the researchers mapped the birds' flight paths digitally, the results silenced the room. The birds had traced a near-perfect outline of the same subsurface pulse zones identified in the hydrological data. Their movement was a response to the invisible force rising beneath the Everglades. With wildlife movements mirroring the underground rhythm, scientists feared the next step. If animals were already responding in coordinated waves, then entire ecological layers might begin to fail in patterns far more devastating than anything they had seen before. The collapsing food web. When researchers turned their attention to the organisms that form the base of the Everglades food web, they found disruptions far more severe than anything seen on the surface. The first collapse appeared in the periphyton layer. Periphyton is a mixture of algae, bacteria, and small organic particles that coat the bottom of shallow water. It is fragile and reacts quickly to changes in water depth and sunlight. In some zones, the periphyton expanded into thick carpets. These carpets looked inflated and grew over surrounding plants until they smothered everything beneath them. Only a few miles away, the periphyton was nearly gone. The soil lay bare and nothing grew on it. These sudden growth differences made no sense until the maps were compared. The expansions and the collapses lined up perfectly with the underground pulse zones. The changes followed straight paths that matched the shifts in water pressure recorded earlier in the year. The next sign of failure occurred in the oxygen readings. Dissolved oxygen is the amount of oxygen present in water for fish and insects to breathe. Levels usually rise and fall with temperature or with the presence of algae. Instead, in the altered water pockets, the oxygen levels dropped and stayed low for weeks. There was no algae bloom to consume the oxygen and no temperature spike to explain it. Fish deaths followed quietly. They floated to the edges of ponds without swelling or discoloration. They simply suffocated in water that no longer carried the oxygen they needed. Biologists called this the most silent collapse they had documented because the usual warnings never appeared. Vegetation revealed the next clue. Cattail began growing in wide circles. Each circle radiated outward like ripples made by a stone dropped in a pond. Botanists had never recorded concentric growth rings in cattail. Cattail usually grows in clusters or spreads in irregular shapes based on sunlight and nutrient distribution. These strange rings spread outward with equal spacing between them, suggesting that something beneath the soil had pushed upward in a series of pulses. Acoustic monitors added another layer of evidence. These devices record the natural sounds of the Everglades, including birds, insects, and small mammals. In several regions, the monitors captured sudden silence. These sound voids did not grow slowly. They formed almost overnight. Entire sections of marsh that once echoed with the calls of herons and the buzzing of insects became empty and still. The animals were not dead. They were simply not there anymore. Predators confirmed the breakdown. Raccoons appeared thin and confused. They scavenged during daylight hours even though they are usually nocturnal. Their behavior suggested they could not sense danger or food properly. Opossums wandered across open marsh areas without hesitation, ignoring threats they would normally avoid. Biologists concluded that these animals had lost synchronization with the signals that tell them when to hunt, when to hide, and when to sleep. Their internal clocks had stopped matching the environment. When ecologists finally assembled all the maps, the truth was impossible to ignore. Every pattern of collapse pointed to the same underground corridors. Faced with this convergence, investigators began tracing every human action that could have placed new pressure on the Everglades. When they examined the major restoration efforts carried out in recent years, they uncovered a chain of consequences no one had predicted and no one was prepared to face. The brutal trigger. For most of its recorded history, people treated the Everglades as something they could control. They cut it, drained it, carved it, and forced it into artificial shapes. Very few understood the truth. The Everglades was not a swamp. It was a slow, shallow river that carried life in a fragile sheet of water only a few inches deep. Every plant and every creature depended on that thin layer. When humans altered it even slightly, the ecosystem broke in ways that no one expected. By the late 20th century, the consequences were brutal. Sawgrass meadows collapsed into open water, soil dissolved into floating peat ponds, wading bird numbers dropped by more than 90% in some regions. The Florida panther starved in shrinking hunting grounds. Saltwater crept inland as freshwater pressure weakened. Tree islands dried, burned, and in some places disappeared. These disasters pushed Florida into a corner. Something had to be done, or the Everglades would die in plain sight. That urgency created the belief that the ecosystem could be repaired with the right engineering plan. When ecologists argued that restoring historic water flow was the only hope, the state listened. The idea was simple. Water once moved freely from north to south in a steady sheet. If that path could be restored, the Everglades might repair itself. It sounded logical. It sounded safe. It also ignored the one question no one had fully investigated. What would happen underground when the surface water was forced back into its old routes? Engineers reopened ancient flow paths. They removed levees and cut openings in spots that had been sealed for nearly a century. On paper, the changes looked small. Out in the wetlands, the results were immediate. The returning water pushed with far more force than anyone predicted. That force did not spread gently through marsh grass. It traveled downward into the ground, past the soil, and into the limestone foundation that held the entire Everglades in place. That foundation was not stable. It was porous and fragile, shaped by thousands of years of slow erosion. Old drainage projects had already cracked it. Agricultural canals had already weakened it. Water control systems had already twisted its natural pressure patterns. But no one realized how close it was to breaking. Once the restoration changes began, the limestone finally reacted. Water-filled cavities that had been dry for decades. Cracks widened. Dormant underground pathways woke up. Engineers reviewing old geological archives found references to cavities and conduits that were never mapped or studied in detail. These structures had always been there, hidden deep below the marsh, waiting for the right push. When restoration teams adjusted water timing, the marsh responded with pressure waves that moved straight into these weakened spaces. Hydrologists traced the data and saw movement where no movement should have been. The ground beneath the Everglades was shifting because humans had forced water into a foundation already stretched to its limit. One whistleblower hydrologist finally said what everyone feared. "We thought we were restoring life. We were pouring water into a fractured skeleton." His words marked the moment the team understood the truth. Their intervention had done more than redirect water. It had triggered a response in the ground itself. They still did not know what lay deeper beneath the marsh. They only knew that something down there had begun to move, and it was moving because they woke it. The point of no return beneath the water. The deeper the scientists dug into the data, the more disturbing the picture became. The underground pulse was not a scattered series of anomalies. It had a center. Cross-dataset analysis revealed that every pressure fluctuation, every rhythmic movement, every shift in water behavior was radiating outward from a single point beneath the marsh. That point was a massive limestone cavern, nearly 100 feet below the surface. What stunned the team was not just its size, but its age. The cavern had been stable for thousands of years. It had supported the shallow freshwater sheet flow that defined the Everglades long before humans ever arrived. Its stability had been one of the silent foundations of the entire ecosystem, and now it was failing. The cavern's ceiling showed signs of flexing, small and subtle motions that should not have been possible in solid rock. As it weakened, it generated pulses of pressure that traveled upward through soil and water. These pulses matched the same movements caught in the automatic monitoring footage, the synchronized ripples, the sudden drops in water depth. Every unexplained surface event had a single underground source. The cavern was not just deteriorating, it was moving. Hydrostatic models simulated what would happen if the cavern continued to widen. The predictions were almost impossible to accept. If the cavern's roof thinned further, water would begin choosing new paths rather than following historic routes. Traditional wet and dry seasons would no longer operate on the cycles that shaped the Everglades for centuries. Freshwater layers that once floated securely above denser saltwater could collapse downward, allowing saltwater to creep into areas that had never been touched by the sea. Entire regions of marsh could sink into newly formed voids. Others could suddenly transform into open water. The Everglades would not simply change, it would become unrecognizable. The deeper the analysis went, the more unavoidable the truth became. The cavern had not begun collapsing on its own. The first movements appeared immediately after the surface was altered. The same season engineers redirected water and reopened long-sealed channels. Every dataset pointed to the same conclusion. The underground system had been stable until the surface changes sent new pressure downward. Human attempts to repair the Everglades had pressed directly into the ancient limestone network and forced it into motion. During a closed-door briefing, one geologist finally said what the data had been implying all along. "This wasn't a natural awakening," he told the room. "We didn't stumble onto a shifting foundation. We pushed it. We drove water into the one structure that was never meant to be disturbed." His voice stayed level, but the meaning was devastating. The pulse was not a mystery rising on its own. It was the direct reaction of a buried system that humans had unknowingly provoked. As the analysis continued, scientists found something even more unsettling. The cavern was not an isolated structure. It appeared to be part of a network of deep, karst voids, interconnected chambers formed over geological time by dissolving limestone. These voids behaved like valves. When pressure built in one, another shifted to compensate. Under normal conditions, these movements were slow and harmless. But under stress, they could open and close with enough force to alter the entire hydrological rhythm of the region. This meant the underground pulse was not a single collapsing chamber. It was a system responding to stress in coordinated, self-reinforcing waves. In one confidential briefing, a senior geologist summarized the discovery with a line that haunted everyone who heard it. He said, "We did not disrupt an ecosystem. We awakened the foundation beneath it." His words marked a staggering realization. The Everglades was no longer reacting at the surface. It was reacting through the bedrock that had shaped it for thousands of years. The pulse was not a glitch. It was the new governing force of the landscape. The darkest revelation came from long-term projections. If the collapse accelerated, the pulse would not remain contained beneath the Everglades. It could spread outward into the aquifer system that supplies drinking water to millions of people. A shift in pressure in one chamber could affect water quality and availability across an entire region. The foundation that had once supported the Everglades could destabilize the human world above it. Make sure to click the cards on the screen now for more interesting videos.